Welcome to Flat Ride of the Week, episode 30. Today marks exactly 1 year since the original episode of Flat Ride of the Week debuted on my channel. Since then, me and Alex have learned a lot and reflected back on some of our older episodes. We both agree that our original video on Enterprises was very lacking, and since that video has debuted, both me and Alex have ridden many more Enterprise rides and flat rides in general. I, for one, have since become a flat ride enthusiast and learned a lot about operating many flat rides at Cedar Point thanks to this series. As such, we both agreed that for episode 30, Enterprise rides deserve to be revisited. If we don't cover a specific model of ride that you are expecting to be covered with Enterprise rides, please know that we consider that model to be two separate from Enterprises, and it will get its own video someday in the future. As always, if we say something that's incorrect, please correct us in the comment section below. And we also have Tino from Kennywood joining us today. He operated the Lost Volcano at Kennywood, and he'll be giving us some insight on the operations of these rides. And we're going to go ahead and start with the history.
So the Enterprises were inspired by the Super Passat ride, which was manufactured by German manufacturer Close. It debuted in the early 60s, and it was also built in-house by German families.
There was a second rare version of the Super Passat that went 180 degrees instead of 90. It's unknown who made this ride, but some believe it was made by a Spanish company. It was introduced in the 1960s.
And then in 1973, Schwarzkopf debuted their first Enterprise. They were the first one to make the real Enterprise rides as we know them all today. The model was 59 feet or 18 meters tall. It had 16 gondolas, and the gondolas could fit 2 people. They were first sold to some German showmen, and some of them ended up at parks, such as the one that was sold to German showman Dolish. It operated at my home park Bellewaerde for a long time until it burned down, sadly, in the 80s. And then the Schwarzkopf Enterprise 2, it's pretty much the same as the Enterprise 1, but it has a different load and unload platform around the ride. And I'm also going to mention that they worked together with French company Reverchon for some gondolas, because the one that was burnt down was actually sent to Reverchon for a whole refurbishment.
Then there is the Schwarzkopf Enterprise 3, which is probably the most familiar Schwarzkopf Enterprise in the United States anyways. This one was 64 feet tall, or 19.5 meters. It had 21 gondolas and 2 people per gondola. This is the larger and, again, arguably most well-known model. It was introduced in 1975. It's transportable or permanent, and every Schwarzkopf Enterprise that I'm aware of that currently is operating inside the United States is a Enterprise 3.
And then the Schwarzkopf Enterprise 4, it was 51 feet or 15.5 meters tall. Just like the Enterprise 1, it has 16 gondolas, and it's some kind of newer version of the Enterprise 1, and it was introduced in 1979. The gondolas were pretty much identical to the ones that are on the Enterprise 3. And then the competition, the Huss models were introduced in 1975, and Huss were actually the ones that got the patent, while they were not the first ones to make an Enterprise. Anyways, Huss's Enterprise is approximately 20 meters or 65 feet tall. It has 20 gondolas, and it can also fit 2 people per gondola. So there's 40 people per ride. And then in 1978, Huss introduced the UFO. It is as tall as a normal Enterprise. It has 12 gondolas, which fit 4 people. So the total capacity is 48 people per ride. It uses the same lifting mechanism and floor structure as the Enterprise. And then the Flyaway, it was introduced in 2000. It's approximately 22 meters or 79 feet tall. It has 18 gondolas which fit 2 people, so 36 people per ride. And it's some kind of flying version of the Enterprise. So you are in a flying position like you are on, for example, a Volara coaster. And I've heard from some people who've ridden it that it was not really a good experience. Anyway, moving on to the Skylab, it was a larger version of the Enterprise. It had 15 gondolas, which each fit 4 people, so that's 60 people per ride in total. And there's also a Japanese version of the Skylab, and there's still one of these operating at the Yokohama Cosmo World Park, the park which is well known for diving coaster Vanish. And this Japanese model actually has 5 gondolas more than the Huss model. One thing it can't do is go 90 degrees. It actually can't go 90 degrees like the Huss one.
Heinz Fots made 2 of them, one at Darien Lake in 1981, and one traveling in New Zealand, which originally traveled in Germany with Showman Muller, and it was named Orion, and that one was built in 1976, so a little bit older. These Heinz Fots ones are a little bit weirder. I've ridden the one at Darien Lake. They have a lower height requirement than the Huss and Schwarzkopf ones, and they also are a little bit jankier. You get some weird airtime on an Enterprise. It's definitely a weird experience, and if you're ever at Darien Lake, I strongly advise riding their Enterprise because of that. And then a lot of other companies made knockoffs, and quite a few in-house Enterprises were also built. Moving on to the ride experience themselves, all of us here have ridden a good number of Enterprises. This past year, I was able to ride a Schwarzkopf Enterprise 3, and I personally enjoy it much more than the Huss versions or the Heinz Fotzi versions, personally. And one more we have to mention for the competition is the modern Zamperla Endeavor. This is definitely the newest take on the Enterprise. These have recently become popular with a lot of Six Flags parks and a few other parks in and outside the US. These come in 2 specific models. One is mobile and one is a park version. The park version is, of course, slightly larger. The park version can fit 48 riders, with the mobile version fitting 24. The park version also is 2 meters taller, standing at 20 meters versus the 18 meters of the transportable version. These rides have over-the-shoulder restraints and floorless gondolas. I personally have ridden one of these, the one at St. Louis. I personally did not like it very much, didn't find it to be very forceful at all, especially when compared to the Huss or Schwarzkopf Enterprises.
Well, I have been on 3 Huss Enterprises, and one of them, which was traveling in France, actually had a backwards section of the cycle, so it would just lower the arm to somewhere around, let's say, 40 degrees, and then it just switches direction. It goes backwards. If I'm not wrong, every Huss Enterprise can go backwards, but pretty much no one does it. But the backward sensation is really weird. It is not that much different from the forward sensation on an Enterprise, but it still feels very weird. It's something you have to experience yourself. So if you ever see a Huss Enterprise that goes backwards, definitely ride it. It's something very rare.
Alright, and then moving on to the other facts.
The prototype Huss Flyway was on display at IAAPA in the year 2000 in Atlanta. After that, it got sold to Taiwan, and it's still operating at a park to this day. And then in 1982, a tragic accident happened with 6 deaths on a fair in Germany. The Skylab was just operating normally until it crashed into a crane of a ride that was disassembling next to it. The Skylab actually still operated for a very long time. It was eventually sold to Israel, where it operated at a park named Luna Park in Tel Aviv. But sadly, it was scrapped some few years ago, and the only thing that's left of the ride is the backdrop. It's still in the park. And then there was also a pretty interesting event on a Huss Enterprise at Tivoli Tur in Estonia. The Enterprise caught fire, and there's some very rare footage of this. Luckily, there were no deaths with this event, only 37 injured. That's quite a lot, but still no deaths, so that's good. And actually, the Enterprise was refurbished after this fire, and it then traveled in the Netherlands, and later it got sold to Nigeria, where it still operates to this day. So it's really impressive to know that an Enterprise that caught fire so badly is still operating.
All right, and then we are going to move on to the actual operation of these rides. We have Tino here, who operated Volcano at Kennywood and has some fun stories about the weirdness that is the Huss Enterprise.
Yes, so Volcano had a pretty quirky control system. So for the most part, Volcano was an automatic ride. So on the control panel, we had an auto on button that would run through the ride sequence itself. And you also had the option of running the ride manually. So to run the ride automatically, there was an auto on button that you would just push and it would run through the ride program itself. You could also run the ride manually by pushing the corresponding turn, lift up, lift down, and brake buttons. So the normal ride program was you'd push auto on, the ride would begin the turn, and the turn button would actually light up on the panel as well. After it did that for a little bit, got up to full speed, the lift up button would light up and the ride would begin to lift, reaching its about 90-degree angle. It'd run for a little bit up there, and after it ran at that angle for a good period of time, the lift down light would turn on, the ride would bring itself down, and once it was completely down, it would brake itself. Generally speaking, during normal operations, the only button you would actually have to push was auto on, and the ride would just run. However, there are unusual circumstances that happen in ride operations, say, for whatever reason, the guest needs to get off because of an illness, or some other reason, a restraint comes undone, stuff like that. If that were to happen, there's also an auto off button, which at first thought you'd think, oh, sweet, that automatically stops the ride. No. What it does is it stops the sequence of the ride wherever it was in the sequence. So, for example, let's say I'm running a normal cycle, I push auto on, the ride starts turning and it's on its way to lift up to that 90-degree angle. If I push auto off, it'll still continue to lift all the way up because that was the last thing it was doing in the sequence. However, once it lifts, it would just stay there. And it would continue spinning in that vertical position until the operator would manually press lift down and brake. It was up to so auto off, all auto off did was it just stops the automatic sequence, and that switches the ride effectively to manual mode. Which means, theoretically speaking, yes, you could actually start the ride in automatic and then switch it to manual in the middle of operation.
That's kind of neat.
The elegance of it was kind of undermined by the fact that this panel was also a bit quirky. And so if you did really anything that the control system wasn't directly expecting, for example, say the ride was running in automatic and you pushed, say, lift down, or you tried to brake the ride. Brake as in pushing the brake button on the panel to slow it down. Not brake, yeah. So if you did that, there's a chance that the control system could kind of lose its bearings and kind of lose its state of mind, and it would just keep doing whatever it was doing. And in those kinds of scenarios, then you basically have to resort to cutting off the power and just letting the ride coast back down. But yeah, so there was no simple ride stop button like some other flat rides have, where the computer can intelligently determine how to stop the ride gracefully. So another interesting quirk that this panel has is there's actually a button on the panel called Turn Slow. So the Turn Slow button, you would, as the name suggests, you would think it would turn the ride slowly, and the way it was described kind of in our standard operating procedures was you'd use that to basically line up one of the cars with the exit in case of, say, like you had the ADA guest on the ride or whatever, you wanted to bring them closer to the exit. The way that button functioned was more analogous to, say, like a cruise control on a car, where basically holding down the button would keep the ride turning at whatever speed the ride was rotating at when you push the button. So if you push the button just before the ride was about to completely stop, it would run at that very, very, very slow speed, just keep going around until you release the button. If you pushed it right after the main rotation stop, you can hear the ride slow down after it comes all the way down, and the motor kind of slows down significantly. If you push it then, it'll still run at that faster speed, but it's not like full speed, it's just kind of coasting. But if you push that button before the motor kind of slows down, it'll just continue running at full speed and it won't stop. And that's actually one of those systems where the control system can go into the weeds and it doesn't really know what the heck's going on, so it just kind of keeps spinning and it doesn't know what to do. And you can't stop it with the brake button because it wasn't expecting that at all. It just...
So you'd have to cut power.
Yeah, you'd have to cut power, basically.
Wow.
In those scenarios. And that's not even a guarantee that would happen. It's just one of those weird edge case scenarios that could occur with this panel. So some other interesting quirks with this thing. So a lot of modern rides, they have some sort of fault indicator if something goes wrong. The closest thing this really has to a fault indicator is there's a pressure light on the panel that indicates, hey, your hydraulic pressure is low or whatever. What's interesting is there does not appear, at least on our panel, to be some sort of manual mode, which means you can just acknowledge it by using the control button directly next to it. However, if you do not push control when the pressure light comes on, the ride doesn't stop. It just pauses the sequence, as we discussed before. It's kind of like pushing auto off. So, especially for like new ride operators who maybe are still picking up on some of the procedures that they've learned, if they don't know that they have to push control, it's very possible for them to get the ride stuck up in the air, rotating at 90 degrees, and they can't bring the ride down because they forgot, oh yeah, I have to push control before it'll let me do anything. If it faults, or if the pressure light comes on. That's a pretty good lead into just some of the other weird quirks I've heard of, and I've sort of experienced. So I've talked about before, with the kind of pushing things at the wrong time. Almost if you hit like the edge of a timer, for example, you can throw the ride into a weird state where it just doesn't know quite what the heck's going on, and for whatever reason, your brake functionality doesn't work. You have to e-stop. That's probably like the biggest thing I've personally noticed. Although, generally speaking, in those scenarios, I've been able to stop the ride using like the brake button. Like I've never experienced the ride itself locking itself out of control. However, what I have heard is, and some other ride operators, I think Kenny can attest to this as well, is there are instances where interlocks on these rides fail, and pushing auto on, for example, could, for whatever reason, the turn sequence could fail and the ride could start to lift itself up without turning. So, again, I have not witnessed that personally. However, I have heard of that happening with this specific ride. So again, that could be a failure again of the interlocks. It could be a weird thing with the timing of the steps. Like, I'm not sure. I don't know quite the specific implementation, but it's just one of those weird quirks with this ride.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a frequent theme throughout everything with the Huss Enterprise. But it's just very quirky, very old-fashioned in a lot of ways. I mean, with all those manual control options, you just wouldn't see that in a flat ride built, anytime after the 70s, pretty much.
And the other thing, too, so for those unfamiliar, Kennywood's Volcano is actually from Light Compounds. It was replaced in, I believe, 2016. And I am not sure if the control system from Light Compounds came down with it. I imagine it did. So, I mean, from what it sounds like just looking at some of the notes we looked at earlier with Witch's Wheel, it sounds like the control systems were very, very similar. So, if not identical.
Yeah. We also have a lot of notes on here. We had a former ride operator of Witch's Wheel give us some notes on the operation of that ride, and a lot of stuff between Witch's Wheel and Volcano really lined up. But it really does show, as a whole, that these rides they're very quirky, clearly, by the testaments of both ride operators. And they're also disappearing, because when we made the first episode of Flat Ride of the Week, Volcano was still an operating ride. I actually have written it since we made that. It's kind of sad. Volcano was still an operating ride, and Witch's Wheel just closed. Now Witch's Wheel is in the pretty distant past, it feels like, and Volcano is, unfortunately,
it's gone.
Being removed. So
being removed this week.
If you have an Enterprise at your home park or home fairground, whatever it may be, especially if it's a Huss one, they are certainly disappearing. The Schwarzkopf ones, the ones that have stuck around, like the one at Fun Spot, Orlando and Carowinds come to mind. I think California's Great America has one as well. Those seem to be quite a bit more reliable. You probably can count on those sticking around for quite a bit longer. I mean, it's Schwarzkopf. What do you expect?
Yep.
But the Huss ones definitely are disappearing. So get out there and ride them.
Don't bank on reliability for a ride to be safe. Because honestly, like, even with Keddiewoods, like, even with the quirks I've described, like, Volcano, generally speaking, was a very, very reliable ride from at least my experience working it. And what we got, what was essentially a very good model of the ride in 2016 from Light Compounds, a ride that really, generally speaking, did not have that many issues, and 4 years later, here we are seeing it removed.
If you have an Enterprise at a park near you, get out there and ride it. You don't know how much longer it has left. I mean, these control systems are pretty whack. So
yeah. Yes, go ride them. They are excellent rides. I absolutely love Volcano. I do miss it.
Or better yet, if you have one at your home park, go work there. Go work one of these rides.
Oh yeah.
Give us your experience working one of these weird and old-fashioned flat rides. And speaking of old and weird and old-fashioned flat rides, just wait for Flat Ride of the Week Monsters when we get back to those. Those will be a very special video. But that will round out that for the Enterprises. Tino, do you have anything else you want to add in the end?
I don't think so. I think we've pretty much covered all the big points. So.
All right. Well, thanks for watching, and we will see you sometime soon. Not guaranteeing next week. We'll see you sometime soon. Bye-bye.